All right, welcome back. Fade to Black. Dane Wigington is here. Excited. Tomorrow night, Sonia Grace. Wednesday night, director, researcher, James Fox is here. Thursday night is Fader night. Open lines all night long. But tonight it's Dane. With a background in solar energy, former employee of Bechtel Power Corporation, and as a licensed contractor here in California and Arizona. He is the lead researcher for geoengineeringwatch.org. I spent my weekend over there. It's such a great website. And has investigated all levels of geoengineering, from stratospheric aerosol geoengineering, SAG, to solar radiation management, SRM, to ionosphere heater facilities like HARP. Dane has appeared in numerous films, radio interviews in an effort to educate the public on the extremely dire environmental and health dangers we face from the ongoing global climate intervention programs. He lives right here in California, and I would like to welcome back to Fade to Black, Dane Wigington. Dane, good evening. How are you?
Good, Jimmy. Can you hear me okay?
A little louder, but yeah.
Okay. Sorry. We're having an odd, unusual situation on this end that we haven't had before. So I hope you hear me okay. I'll try to work with it as we go.
Yeah, you're getting louder, so just get closer to the microphone.
How's that right there?
Okay, we'll survive. You know, it's called fighting the man, Dane. Fighting the man. You know, and you're so used to it. But welcome back, and getting you back on the program, especially right now for me, it couldn't come at a more important time. But things are strange on this planet when I hear everybody arguing about climate change, climate engineering, and both sides of the fence can't seem to agree as to what is actually going on, can they?
Yeah, there's a lot of dichotomous thinking going on, and that needs to go away, because we're not dealing with a this or that equation. We're dealing with a this and that equation. It's important to remember anything, everything, every form of human activity that affects the energy balance of the planet is a form of geoengineering. That being said, the intentional programs to intervene in Earth's climate systems is the greatest and most immediate threat of all. And in the attempt to mask the damage done to the planet from countless forms of anthropogenic activity, climate engineering is radically further fueling the overall fire on every front. It's decimating every aspect of Earth's life support system. So I hope people on every side of the fence can get past dichotomous thinking, understand that it's not a simple equation. There are many factors involved, but all that being said, climate engineering is the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat, Jimmy.
The debates that are going on, Dane, and I know that you see and read this every day, and I read your newsletter when you send it out a couple times a week. I'm on top of it. But what I find the most fascinating is that everybody can agree on, or generally, that there is something happening. But nobody can agree on a scientific level and on an educated level as to what is causing it. And that's the part for me. I just sit back and go, do we have to argue about this? Or can't we just recognize that this is a situation where we are at the tipping point and we've got to come up with some solutions? Isn't that the most fascinating part about this, where science is in agreement, but yet they want to fight about it?
In regards to academia, the propensity to ignore the climate engineering elephant in the room is truly perplexing. And there can be no legitimate discussion about the climate or the state of the climate without first and foremost addressing climate engineering. Mm-hmm. That is not to negate all other forms of human activity. And this is important as well. Too many people have tried to convince themselves that paving the planet, cutting down the forests, poisoning the oceans is all fine, but that has no effect, which is not true, of course. It can't not have an effect. That being said, again, though, climate engineering's for over 70 years. Over 70 years, the Earth's life support systems have been intervened with. So when you hear people claim that they've seen certain scenarios 20, 30, 40 years ago. Maybe they have, but that doesn't mean it was natural, because we know that these programs were deployed at full scale immediately after World War II. Mm-hmm. But the bottom line is, it's all of the above. Now, climate engineering in particular has prevented the planet from responding to the damage done. That's critical to understand. As certain changes take place in the planet, it would naturally try to compensate or reach another equilibrium. Climate engineering has disabled it from being able to do that. This is also important to understand. Jimmy, when people talk about Earth's natural cyclical patterns, that does not apply here. It doesn't apply any more than throwing somebody off a 100-story building and say, hey, people die, it's natural. No, they wouldn't have died right then if you wouldn't have thrown them off the building. Mathematically speaking, the changes happening on our planet are happening conservatively, statistically, mathematically, 170 times faster than any previous paleo event. So this is not natural in any way, shape, or form, with climate engineering being the single greatest factor in the equation. But that doesn't mean the only factor by any means. If you have many slices to a pie, you have one slice that's bigger than the rest, but that doesn't mean the rest don't count. So it's important to frame this correctly, and important for people to understand it's not a simple equation. We have not been good stewards to the planet. I don't think there's any arguing that one. But that being said, climate engineering is derailing every imaginable aspect of Earth's life support systems. And on top of that, Jimmy, it's contaminating every single breath we take, you, me, and everyone else. And that's an immediate fight for life.
How are the scientists today responding to your work and others that are reporting on geoengineering? Is it something that's closer to being recognized and discussed, or is that still the elephant in the room?
It's getting closer because it's getting all but impossible to hide. And we have just completed, in the last week and a half, a project that's been in the works for a very long time. Geoengineering Watch and a team of scientists and attorneys that we work with, we have just completed the first of its kind atmospheric testing, specifically looking for confirmation of climate engineering contamination at altitude. We have successfully confirmed that. I have more to announce at a later date. Our lab testing is extraordinarily extensive and ongoing, but this is testing that is court admissible. And I have to leave it at that point. I'm not at liberty to say anymore. Again, we're working with a team of attorneys. We have confidentiality agreements. But the bottom line is academia has backed themselves into quite a corner by doubling down on their denial for so long. Now, what happens when this is fully exposed? Those in academia who denied it the whole time have a lot of explaining to do. And there's only two possibilities for their denial. They're either criminally negligent of the profession in which they claim to be an expert, or they're lying. Take your pick.
This, I realized, I understand the, you don't have the ability to comment a whole lot further, but I'm going to press you on a couple of points if I may. And if you can't answer, you just can't answer. Is this something that Washington will undoubtedly reply in a very negative sense if the proof is that there are metals in the atmosphere, that there's geoengineering going on at altitude that can only be done by with the knowledge of Washington, whether they are part of it or not? But is this something that they're going to respond to or ignore?
If we can expose this issue, I don't think they'll have any choice but to respond. I think there'll be a shockwave around the globe as populations realize they've been subjected to a grand and lethal experiment without their knowledge or consent, an experiment from which there is no return. The liability factor in this equation alone has long since been incomprehensible. The moment you intervene with the climate system at this level, no event can be considered natural. Thus, every event has to be considered to some degree a consequence of climate engineering operations. Mm-hmm. This disclosure will overturn the system. I would argue it will galvanize people in a common cause, understanding what their governments have done to them. The collusion and cooperation on this issue is profound. No matter what adversarial scenarios between opposing nations China, Russia, U.S., on the surface, the collusion and cooperation with this issue is absolutely positively going on. You can't just climate engineer over your own country. We have Senate documents 800 pages long posted to Geoengineering Watch that we originally found. The yellow highlights and some of those that you might see in other sources are ours. Your listeners can look it up by searching massive Senate document, geoengineeringwatch.org. In that document, it's expressly described the cooperation between normally opposing nations because of the cross-border ramifications. Now, there are exceptions to this. One exception is Iran. They are certainly not participating in these programs, and whatever anyone thinks about Iran in any other sense, they are definitely not participating. Perhaps one of the reasons they're being targeted, in addition to the desire for them to no longer use the dollar as the reserve currency, and there's other factors as well. But I think we should consider, in the case of Iran, that they have invaded nobody for 230 years. The U.S. has invaded nearly 100 nations in as many years. And there are issues going on like climate engineering. In the case of Iran, they have spoken on the floor of the UN stating, and they have sophisticated military and atmospheric monitoring equipment. They stated on the floor of the UN that the precipitation for their country was being cut off by NATO weather modification programs. And that is absolutely positively the truth. Here's my question. What would we do? What would Americans do if the Iranian military or other nation allies with them were cutting off the precipitation to the U.S.? Would we not consider that an act of war?
Isn't that one of the key elements of geoengineering is used as a weapon system, right? We're not dropping nuclear bombs. We're starving the population, which is not only an act of war, of course, but that's got to be one of the most effective tools that one could almost hope for in a very sick scenario.
It absolutely is. That is a core objective of climate engineering. It is the crown jewel weapon of the power structure. They can destabilize and topple nations without the populations of those nations ever even realizing they are at war. Let's look at all the nations named after 9/11 by General Wesley Clark as targets to be taken down in the Middle East. Every one of those nations has since underwent a once in 1,000 year drought. That is not nature. That's climate modification. Nations in Africa, same scenario, cutting off of the precipitation, and then those nations being forced to allow what amounts to U.S. occupation. So again, I realize we have many honorable men and women in the U.S. military. What I'm asking them to do is to examine what they're a part of. There's a lot of compartmentalization so that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. We have two former U.S. Air Force generals working with our team, a former U.S. Air Force colonel. They did not realize these programs are going on, and they are understandably distressed about this now. And I want to stress this, the ramifications to us, any future we may yet have, and to the planet as a whole, is grave, beyond imagination from climate engineering. It's destroying the ozone layer, disrupting the hydrological cycle, and contaminating the entire planet. On the current course, Jimmy, mathematically speaking, and I realize people may roll their eyes and walk away at this statement, but none of us will be here much longer, and that is a statistical mathematical fact. And when I say that, I don't mean centuries out or decades out. Our time horizon is unimaginably short, mathematically speaking, if the current rate of biosphere disintegration is allowed to continue, and climate engineering being at the top of the causal factors.
It's not a coincidence, is it, that the countries that are on our enemies list, North Korea is a perfect example, they can't grow anything there. South Korea, a couple of miles south of North Korea, is just fine. That's not coincidence. Afghanistan, you can't grow anything there. And it's just fascinating to see that these very specific areas just can't seem to grow anything.
It is not a coincidence, as you correctly stated. And the use of this weapon is not limited to opposing nations. At this point, we must consider parts of the USA also in the crosshairs. In the case of California, whatever the objectives, whatever the agendas, we can debate that. But the fact that climate engineering operations are and have been cutting off the flow of precipitation to the state, contaminating soils and waters, destroying the ozone layer, rendering it difficult, if not impossible, to grow here as well under many circumstances now. The fact that that is directly related to climate engineering, including the fires, Jimmy, the fires are most directly related to climate engineering. And this is not to say, again, because many people don't listen to the entire statements when I'm trying to frame something accurately. This is not to say that other forms of human activity have not affected Earth's energy balance and disrupted the equilibrium that is here. I fully acknowledge that fact. I acknowledge all the factors, but what I'm stating is, mathematically speaking, climate engineering is the single most disruptive of all. And for example, in the case of the wildfires, not only is it cutting off precipitation, toxifying soils, which kills root systems, and they're dying back just as fast as the crowns of the trees are dying back. We have more dry lightning because we have an ionized atmosphere. It's more electrically conductive. We have a destroyed ozone layer that's frying the trees from the top down. We have an incendiary dust, i.e. heavy metals like aluminum that are coating foliage from every imaginable direction. Climate engineering is fueling the wildfires, and we believe we have enough data now to confirm that the extraordinary northern latitude wildfire crisis, and the same has happened in the southern hemisphere, is actually being utilized by the climate engineers to achieve enough atmospheric particulate loading, which spins toward the polar regions because of the Coriolis effect, in order to provide a temporary, and I stress that word, temporary cooling effect for the polar regions. And that's how desperate they are. Climate engineering, again, core problem of the whole equation.
Why the specific regions inside of the United States? Is it a monetary decision? Is it to control agriculture? Is it part of the economy? Why control it here? I know that they do, and I could see, especially here in California, the reason why I asked the question, here in California, which literally feeds the entire United States in a 12-month cycle. There are reasons why you can get strawberries in the winter in Chicago, and we recognize that. But is it here in California, where we have these specific areas of drought, where it should be never a shortage of water here? Farmers weren't able to, and it was a bad 2-year run we had. Is that an economic decision, to raise the prices of fruits and vegetables? What's the reason for it?
You must be careful not to try to oversimplify the situation. Is there disaster capitalism occurring in this equation? Absolutely. It's comparable, as I've given this example before, to pirates loading their pockets up as the ship sinks, and they're going to sink with it. But at the moment, they still are more concerned about lining their pockets. So we have disaster capitalism occurring. Absolutely. We have what amounts to a weather disaster trading derivatives market, that is a gaming casino ran by those who are orchestrating the weather. But we have to look at the bigger picture. There are feedback loops triggered on the planet already that cannot be turned off. So in addition to climate engineering being used for weather warfare, a primary objective is to mask the true severity of what's unfolding from populations, specifically U.S. populations is critical in this equation, to mask the severity and immediacy of what's unfolding until the last possible moment. So back to the water and the flooding. There's a process called chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. These are patented processes. We have patents going back over 50 years for these processes. What does this mean? It means that they can seed cloud moisture with chemically and or biological nucleating agents, which causes ice to form at much above normal temperatures. That creates a cold, dense layer of air that descends to the surface. They can chemically convert what should have been a liquid precipitation event, i.e. rain, into snow. And we're not speculating. The Chinese scientists openly announced that they were doing the same, engineering winter weather. Fox News and Popular Science covered this. Any of your listeners can look it up, or they can go to the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org and search the engineering winter section and learn far more than they wanted to know. So what objective does this carry out? It confuses and divides the population as to the true state of climate collapse and the true state of pending and very imminent now societal collapse. It masks that from the population until the last possible moment. And in the meantime, everything we described is still going on. Weather warfare, disaster capitalism, all of that going on. But again, a complicated equation, many agendas being carried out, not just a this or that equation, much more complex.
When we come back after the break, the reason why we'll continue this conversation after the break, but the reason why that I ask is that by possibly doing something short-sighted in a general area, say California, that the after effects of that is what is happening high in the atmosphere. And nature is nature, and this planet runs a certain way. By doing something short-sighted for capital gains, we're having these long-term effects, right? Is that something else that is happening?
Yes, absolutely. The downstream consequences are unimaginable. But we have so many factors in the equation. We have perhaps as many as 50 feedback loops right now, which once triggered, feed on themselves. So in the case of, this is the biggest one of all, so this is the one I will name, methane. Not talking about cow flatulence, talking about formerly frozen methane hydrate and clathrate deposits, Bermuda Triangle. That's been methane released for many, many decades. That's when the sea floor warms, you have huge methane fields that release. It's happening in the Arctic on an unimaginable scale right now. What happens when that methane migrates through the water column, hits the sea surface, and migrates into the atmosphere? It starts to cover the planet like a layer of glass. We also have other gases. Nitrous oxide is another. These gases are profoundly more effective at trapping heat than CO2. They're much bigger dangers that are not talked about by the science community. So once you start that heating and the methane starts to cover the planet like a layer of glass, and nitrous oxide as well, then you have more heating, more methane release, more heating. It feeds on itself. Is that clear? And you have about 50 of those cycles going on. Now, climate engineering, as you correctly stated, is triggering its own cycles. The boreal forest burn downs are one. So as they create the conditions that allow for these epic wildfires to occur, those fires add to the overall heating, which adds to more fires, and the cascading effect occurs. So you're exactly right. It's just a very complex equation, and there are many of these feedback loops occurring. Let's take a break right here, Dane. This is Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Geoengineeringwatch.org is the website. The links are at jimmychurchradio.com. Tremendous source of information right there at geoengineeringwatch.org. Tonight, it's Dane Wigington. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. This is Fade to Black. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're listening to a preview of Fade to Black. To get the full episode, go to jimmychurchradio.com and get our podcast. Click on the podcast banner or sign up in the membership area for downloadable MP3s. Everything commercial free. Welcome back, Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tonight, Dane Wigington is here. Geoengineeringwatch.org is the website. Tomorrow night, Sonia Grace. Wednesday night, James Fox. Thursday night, open lines all night long. Tonight, it is Dane. Now, okay, Dane, I have been in Southern California for 35 years. I have fought through 7-year stretches of not a drop of rain. Right? This winter, it has rained for the last 3 months every single day. Right? We've never had that before. And it's not my imagination. It's raining. It rained yesterday. It has not stopped. Is this geoengineering?
Can you hear me okay, Jimmy?
I got you.
Is this audio any better?
It's perfect.
Okay.
You are the man.
In regard to what's happening in Southern California, the climate engineers can and are creating various pressure zones in order to, in some cases, spin enough moisture into the atmosphere to chemically nucleate that moisture, the process I described before the break. Again, it's called chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. We have patents on this going back 50 plus years. So this is one of the ways of cooling things down, although temporarily. That surface layer of cool may be only a few hundred feet thick in some cases. Now, at the same time, we're communicating with aircraft pilots, some commercial, some private. Some of these private pilots on Learjets fly some very important people. They contacted us because they were very alarmed. One former military pilot, their Gulfstream went into a forced automatic descent from over 40,000 feet because it was about 45 degrees above normal outside that aircraft. The air was so warm, the air was not dense enough to carry that aircraft. What we see on satellite imagery right now around the globe, and we look at satellite imagery every single day from all over the globe, we can find nothing that looks like a naturally formed system, meteorologically speaking. It is completely tainted, completely off the rails. We are completely in uncharted territory. So the climate engineers control the spigot, quite literally. They decide where it rains, how much it rains, how toxic that rain will be. And I want to stress the toxic part. In our testing, we have identified, in addition to the usual suspects of heavy metals, aluminum, barium, strontium, polymer fibers, we have now identified positively in snow samples, and these are taken by very highly credentialed scientists that we work with, surfactants. Surfactants are used, well, so you have surfactants in soap. Many people have seen foaming rain, foaming runoff. The surfactants affect the molecular tension of water molecules. There's a lot of various effects and uses. It is a part of the mix with, for example, aluminum nanoparticulates. We know this from the manufacturing statistics and data. It keeps the particles from sticking together. So this comes down in the rain. This is toxic. Synthetic urea is used in chemical ice nucleating. So we have basically the atmosphere, Jimmy, being used as a physics lab with no regard for the consequences whatsoever.
The air is one thing. The atmosphere is one thing. Huge concern. Huge concern. But the oceans, Dane, and you and I remember talking about this a couple of years ago, and what is going on with these dead parts of the ocean. I want to address that for a second. But then the news over the last couple of days about releasing all of the nuclear garbage from Fukushima directly into the ocean, because the ocean is just going to clean itself up anyway, so it's okay to do. Did you hear about this news the other day?
Somebody making that claim that the ocean would clean itself up?
And Fukushima, dumping all of the nuclear waste into the ocean is no big deal.
Yeah, well, we're told a lot of things are no big deal. In the meantime, we are on the fast track to total global planetary omnicide. Let me put a figure behind that, and then I'll back up and answer your questions if I can. Just to put this in statistical perspective for your listeners.
Sure.
We've lost 60% of Earth's wildlife populations in the last 40 years, and I encourage your listeners to investigate everything I say. 60% in 40 years, and the current mathematical trajectory of species loss, the 0 hour for no wildlife left on planet Earth, if the rate of die-off does not accelerate, and it is 2026. 2026.
Wow.
Nearly 10 years ago, geoengineeringwatch.org was the first major website, and we're the largest website on the subject of geoengineering in the world, nearly 33 million visitors. We were the first to publish, based on our work with former government scientists, Fish and Game and Forest Service, that insect populations were completely imploding. Many in academia rolled their eyes and walked away because they are paid not to address the truth. Now they can't hide it any longer. So anyone who bothers to look up insect apocalypse will see exactly what we said a decade ago. 80% plus terrestrial insect population decline and aquatic insect population decline. If the insects can't make it, we will not be here for long. So the bottom line is the web of life, the pillars of the web of life are completely collapsing. Back to the dead oceans in Fukushima. Obviously, Fukushima is an absolute cataclysm with no end in sight, no known technology to fix it, 3 nuclear full-blown China syndrome meltdowns, and we're building 60 more of these reactors right now. We have 400 plus on the globe. All of them are ticking Fukushima time clocks. But is that the major causal factors for the dead oceans you described? No, it is not. Is it a problem? Absolutely. Is it a worsening problem? Absolutely. Is the fish contaminated all the way to the west coast of the U.S.? Absolutely. But nuclear contamination in that form does not kill with the kind of speed we're seeing now. What's the major sources of the die-off? The oceans are warming at catastrophic speed. Warmer water holds far less oxygen. So we have dead zones occurring all over the globe. These are hypoxic and anoxic zones, low and no oxygen. And that is what kills with the greatest speed. Back to the Bermuda Triangle and the ship sinkings there that we now know is methane release from the sea floor. So when you have these massive fields of methane releases, you have hydrogen sulfide can release with it. The water deoxygenates. Everything in that region dies. You have plankton die-off right now. Let's weave that back to geoengineering. Climate engineering destroying the ozone layer, single greatest causal factor for destroying the ozone layer. At the current rate of ozone loss, we're looking at total ozone layer collapse by about 2025 or 2026. So we have a former NASA contract engineer that worked directly with us with equipment we supplied him. So that's one more factor that gives us a very short timeline. But the destroyed ozone layer kills plankton. What's the bottom line pillar, not just for the ocean food chain, but actually for life on Earth? Plankton.
No doubt.
Yeah, correct.
No doubt. And I want you to continue, but we always think of trees as our source of oxygen, right? And okay, all right, okay, we can go with that. Plankton and the oceans are the base of all of the food cycles and the oxygen from the ocean that feeds our atmosphere. And if we're removing the oxygen from the oceans, then you can start to figure out what's going on, right?
Correct. And boreal forests, second greatest source of oxygen on the planet, plankton, greatest source. So the food chain in the ocean is absolutely collapsing. Plankton have to feed in the upper layers of the water column because they photosynthesize. They're being fried with the intense UV. And I'm not stating, though, that this is the only problem. Again, we have Fukushima. We have countless sources of contamination into our seas. I mean, we have poisoned them in every imaginable way. But the warming of the oceans is also a huge factor. Statistically, the planet is warming at the thermal energy equivalent rate, the heat energy equivalent rate of 4 to 5 Hiroshima bombs per second. And I realize that may be hard to fathom for people. I encourage them to look it up. They will find science study citing exactly what I just stated. That's a thermal energy equivalent of about 400,000 Fukushima bombs per day. That energy has gone into the oceans. We're seeing ocean temperatures in some regions of the Arctic 25 degrees above normal. So all of this creates this cascading effect that you described before the last break. And one factor triggers 10 more, which trigger 10 more. Bottom line is we're on the fast track to a lifeless planet. And here's the big variable, Jimmy. It's not that you wake up overnight and the planet stops supporting life overnight, but the power structure knows this is unfolding. They know they can't hide it from the population much longer. And I would argue this. At the moment, they believe they can't hide it any longer. The power structure will play some very big cards, global conflict perhaps, false flags that make 9/11 look like kids playing with firecrackers. Who knows what they will do at this point.
I just want your imagination to run free for a second. What is it that these bankers and these power players at the very top of the pyramid, the very top of everything, what do they expect to be living on when there are no bees to pollinate, when there are no insects, when there are no fish in the oceans? What fun, what beautiful planet are they planning on living on with all of the money and the power in the future if they destroy everything? I just don't understand the moral aspect of this. I don't get it, Dane.
Well, let's examine that question. First, you're exactly correct. Many ask, Jimmy, who are they? Who are they at the top of the pyramid? And you're exactly right. It's the central bankers, i.e. those who run the central bankers. They can print whatever they want for whatever they want. They own militaries, therefore they own countries. That is the top of the food chain, as you correctly stated. In regard to their behavior, again, we have to look at it as a complex scenario, that this paradigm that has been formed has always been a certain near-term death sentence if it was allowed to continue. But those in power, Jimmy, we know how addictive power is. It's certainly perhaps the most addictive factor for certain types of people. And if we look at psychoanalysis of those types of people that end up at the top of the food chain because they do things that you or I wouldn't, there's a common thread in their various forms of psychosis. And that common thread is this, and this is straight from the psychoanalysis manual: a near total lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. They behave like a cancer behaves. And at this point, the whole system is like a cancer, with each cell and perhaps good men and women in this process that are simply in their compartmentalized bubble and don't realize what they're participating in. And the goal of the cancer is what, Jimmy? To proliferate, to expand at any cost. The host eventually dies, and that is the track we're on.
What fun would it be living in a bunker for the next 100 years with your family? Right? Because that's what they're going to end up doing.
Well, we would be fortunate if it was 100 years. If we look at past events in Earth's history, we're in the sixth great mass extinction now, and we're not just entering that curve. We are far into that curve. And if we look at paleo events, the most comparable is called the PETM event, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, 55 million years ago, methane mass expulsion. But again, an event that happened at minimum 170 times slower than what's happening now. But even that event, 55 million years ago, the equilibrium period afterward was about 10 to 20 million years. So I think we need to make it clear that we will never know the planet we have known. At best, we'll know a planet that supports some life. Now, I know that shuts people down, and I want to stress I'm not in any political party. I have unimaginable angst for these so-called environmental organizations and the global warming organizations and their unimaginable hypocrisy for ignoring this issue. They're protecting their 501c3 nonprofits, so they're ignoring the single greatest environmental threat of all, and their hypocrisy has truly left me perplexed. But that being said, the severity of our situation is what it is, and I can't candy coat that. I won't do that. But I would argue this: as dark as the horizon is, if our collective efforts could salvage any part of Earth's life support systems so that someone makes it through this, is that not worth fighting for?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And when we look at these huge global companies like Bayer and Monsanto, these large, DuPont, the large chemical companies that also control every aspect of the geoengineering side of things. One, they have the GMO seeds that are going in the ground. They sell those to the farmers. They loan the farmers the money. And this is on a global scale. This is across countries. They loan them the money in a lease program to purchase the equipment and the seeds. Then they turn around and control the water from the air. They are spraying the air with the stuff that is controlling what they are planting in the ground. And they are paid at every scale and profit from every version of their business model. That ultimately is what is happening today, and nobody wants to stand up and do anything about it, Dane.
Well, what you describe is exactly right, Jimmy. I mean, you've always been completely on top of the scenarios in our paradigm. I know that from our previous conversations, and this is where you end up. We're back at the cancer point where so many are just going about their lives in a sort of a bubble and not realizing that this paradigm in and of itself has pushed us past the point of no return. And I want to stress that too. We are through the guardrail. And as you know, if you crash through the guardrail and you're hurtling through the air, putting on your brakes doesn't do a lot of good at that point. And as I've compared in the past, the human race right now, the majority of the human race, unfortunately, is like the occupants of that car. And they're arguing about what station to put the radio on while they're hurtling through the air toward the bottom of the canyon. And that paradigm has to change. And again, it must change from the bottom up. We are being censored so radically, and I know you know this, you mentioned it earlier. As an example for this, geoengineeringwatch.org should be and was the top of the first page on a Google search, which is the 80% of search engines on the planet. We're the top of the first page for a search of the geoengineering term. about 5 months ago, Google completely erased us, gone, deleted from 20 pages of their listings for the geoengineering term. We're still on the top of other search engines, Bing, DuckDuckGo, but that's the kind of censorship we're experiencing. We have 100,000 YouTube subscribers. It goes out to none. We have 4 massive Facebook pages with 300,000 or 400,000 likes between all of them. Goes out to no one. I mean, they are desperately trying to hide this issue because, again, I would argue of all the challenges we face, this issue is the most grave, the most immediate threat of all, and potentially the most uniting issue for populations all over the globe. If we could expose this, it would unite, catalyze populations into a common cause. They would understand, again, what their governments have done to them.
Over the last year, I have noticed this strange flip-flop on Antarctica and Greenland, in that the news was saying forever that the ice was melting. Ice is melting, everything's shrinking. And now, over the last 6 months, the news has completely flipped, in that now ice is now growing again in Greenland and Antarctica. Are they trying to change the public's perception as to what is going on? Or is there actual cooling and ice is starting to grow again? Which way is it?
Well, as I state this, I'm asking your listeners to not believe me, but to look at, for example, a film online called Chasing Ice. They can watch this. I think it's $2.99 online. So they don't have to believe me or anyone else. They can see with their own eyes a non-political film that shows firsthand unbelievably shocking, riveting footage of ice deposits all over the globe disintegrating. So the story about Greenland that was hyped up to create exactly the effect that it is clearly created was about one single glacier that they statistically made it look like there was more loading on that glacier. Why? Because there's more precipitation there. Why is there more precipitation? Because you have more precipitation on a warming planet. The atmosphere holds 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. The climate engineers can manipulate, direct that, and chemically nucleate it to load a little bit more in one small region. Probably 1/200th of Greenland's surface area. And yet that 1/200th is what made headlines, while the other 199 200ths were disintegrating. So what we have is right now, today, as we speak, record low global polar ice. Right now, today, uncharted territory, record low. What we see with temperature readings, we don't see and I'm not a Gore fan. I want to state that for your listeners. Al Gore was quite the hypocrite. Carbon credits are a sham. But that doesn't change the reality. And climate engineering has been used to divide the population. Exactly what you just described is how climate engineering is used. And remember, Jimmy, all the snow in Boston, 2014, 2015, all the headlines about the record snow in Boston?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What didn't they tell us when that was occurring? They didn't tell us, oh, by the way, 14,000 feet up in the Sierras in the middle of winter, there was nothing, no snow. What don't they tell us about global temperatures? And this is scientifically absolutely indisputed, period. We are at the 413th or 414th consecutive month of above normal global temperatures. And everywhere we monitor, geoengineeringwatch.org monitors, again, we see an underreporting of the official high temperatures, not an overreporting. We're seeing nighttime low temperatures rise twice as fast as daytime highs. When they create an engineered cool down event, and they just did the same thing last year with Lake Erie. You remember that? Lake Erie had record snow?
That's right.
Tiny little area. And they had to use the lake effect snow to create that in one tiny little patch of real estate to nucleate this winter weather. We see the same thing through parts of the Great Lakes regions, even the Minnesota. It just snowed in May. You probably saw that. The Minneapolis got their all-time 117-year record snow for May. Did you see that?
Yep.
All of that, one tiny place in the whole wide world, is used to create a headline that is then used to polarize and divide the population and thus keep their eye off the ball, and certainly to keep their eye off of the sky. So what we see around the globe is absolute off the scale meltdown temperatures. And again, this is not about the type of carbon credit sham or the sort of environmental group mantras that are ignoring the climate engineering elephant in the room. Again, I have great angst for those groups and those people, but the facts are what they are. We live in a fishbowl. Everything we put in the atmosphere doesn't float off into space somewhere. It stays here, and you can't do what we've done to the planet and not have unimaginable consequences.
We just went through these reports a couple of weeks ago here in Southern California. We've had all of this crazy record rain, right? It's been raining every single day. And I enjoy it because it never rains here. It is Southern California. But these reports came out a couple of weeks ago that all of this record rain and record snow, but because of the river system that we have built here, the LA River and so forth, and everything is concrete, that 99% of the water didn't get to the aquifers and replenish anything. It just rinsed out into the ocean. Is there now, and it just like depressed me, right? We wasted the opportunity to save water. It went out into the oceans. Is there any benefit to that fresh water going to the oceans? Does it help us in the back end somewhere? Or was all of this for naught?
Well, certainly when you interfere with the natural tributaries, there are consequences. But that being said, given the type of human development we have now, obviously it would make more sense to retain that water. That being said, this must be considered in the equation. This is the type of data that is not disseminated on any official source. Even though we see larger rain readings in places, and many of those places of late have been in valley areas. For example, in Northern California, in the last several years, Redding, California, which is near where I live, has had substantial rain readings, precipitation events in the valley areas. But what's not occurring? Orographic enhancement. What does that mean? It means in the mountains, for example, northeast of Redding, where I live, during periods of recent years, the historic levels of enhanced rain, orographic enhancement, are not occurring. So in areas far northeast of Redding that historically would have gotten 3 or 4 times the rain Redding would normally get, that is not occurring. Why isn't it occurring? Because what we see is as the moisture is moving in off the Pacific coast, it's aerosolized, i.e. the jet dispersions of tiny particles. What does that do? It creates too many condensation nuclei, too many particles, so the moisture can't combine in a big enough drop to fall as rain. Mm-hmm. So it migrates that moisture further. So we have days and days of this featureless sky as they're migrating that moisture inland to use it inland. Radio frequency transmissions also spreads this in every direction. We might be out to a break, so maybe I'll save this. Should I save this for after the break, Jimmy?
Yeah, save it for after the break. And I'm reading what's going on here in Twitter. Like John just said, we got a lot more rain than usual down here in Kansas City, the most since 1993. Here's somebody else. I live in Akron, Ohio, and yes, this is for real. It's getting worse every year, too. So, yeah, I think all of us can recognize it, and we're all old enough to live through the cycles of spring and winter and summer and see that things are different today. It's not like it was, and something is going on, and we've got to get to the bottom of it. This is Fade to Black. Our guest tonight, Dane Wigington. We come back, we're going to finish where we are right now with this conversation. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Twitter is on fire. I'm reading all of it. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You have just listened to a full hour free preview of Fade to Black. To get the full show, all archives, just go to our podcast section at jimmychurchradio.com. You can also sign up to be a Fadernaut in our membership area, where we have downloadable MP3s. Go to jimmychurchradio.com. Go Bagley Tappy.